The house felt unusually silent as the front door clicked shut behind him. It was a familiar stillness, one he had grown used to over time, but today it carried a different weight. The air inside seemed to hang heavier, as if something was out of place. He walked through the entrance, his footsteps echoing on the hardwood floor, but there was no response. No sound of Julia, his stepmom, bustling about the kitchen or humming as she did sometimes when she was home. He moved through the hallway and up the stairs, the quiet pressing down on him. His room felt like an island of calm in the otherwise empty house. But even here, the silence seemed different. It was as though the walls were holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. He tried to shake it off, settling into his routine, but the unease remained at the back of his mind. The hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen was the only sound that filled the house. The familiar background noise that usually went unnoticed now felt intrusive. He went to his desk and sat down, trying to focus on his homework. The task seemed simple enough, but every time he picked up his pencil, his mind drifted back to the house around him. It was strange, almost as if the place itself was too quiet, too empty. Julia's car wasn't in the driveway. She'd mentioned that morning she would be out for work, so he expected the house to stay like this for a while. But something felt different. The hours seemed to stretch on longer than they should have. He glanced at the clock. It was still early in the afternoon. But there was an undeniable tension building, something in the air that made the house feel less like a home and more like a stage for something yet to unfold. As he tried to shake off the odd feeling and focus, the front door creaked open, signaling Julia's return. But she didn't come in right away. He heard her voice from the hallway, faint but unmistakable. She was on the phone, her words muffled as she walked past the door. Her tone was calm, but there was something in the way she spoke, something that made him pause and wonder what was going on. The conversation ended quickly, and the house fell silent again, but the weight in the air seemed to grow heavier. He went back to his homework, trying to push the thoughts out of his head. But the quiet, the tension, and the strange sense that something was off wouldn't let him relax. He sat there, waiting, watching the clock tick, unable to shake the feeling that the day would end differently than he expected. The hours passed slowly, the house still holding its eerie silence. The sound of his pen scratching across the paper was the only thing breaking through the stillness. Yet, despite his focus, the unease didn't fade. It lingered, quietly building in the back of his mind. Just as he thought he might find a rhythm, he heard footsteps approaching. Julia appeared in the doorway, standing still for a moment as if assessing him. Her presence, usually a comforting one, now felt strangely out of place. She didn't say anything at first, just looked at him for a second longer than necessary before stepping into the room. Her casual smile didn't quite reach her eyes, and her movements seemed deliberate. She walked over to the window and glanced outside, her back to him for a moment, her fingers brushing against the curtain. The simple act felt intentional, almost as if she was trying to avoid making eye contact. The air between them was thick with a silence that had taken on a new edge. He continued with his homework, trying to push the feeling of discomfort away, but it was hard to ignore her presence in the room. She lingered, shifting from foot to foot, like she was waiting for something. Her gaze returned to him now and then, but she didn't say anything. She was just there, watching, in a way that felt different from the usual, casual interactions they shared. It wasn't the kind of silence that was comfortable, the kind that would fill a room when both were lost in their own thoughts. This silence was weighted, full of something unsaid. After a few minutes, Julia finally moved, glancing over her shoulder at him. She didn't mention anything about his homework or ask how his day was going, which was unusual for her. Instead, she made her way toward the door, her movements slow, almost deliberate. Just before leaving, she turned back to face him, offering one last, lingering look before she stepped out of the room. As soon as the door clicked shut behind her, the tension seemed to rise again. It was like the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for the next shift in the atmosphere. He couldn't put his finger on it, but something about Julia's visit didn't sit right. The way she had looked at him, the silence that stretched between them, All of it felt like a puzzle he couldn't solve. Something was changing, something he didn't yet understand, and it made his skin crawl. The rest of the afternoon passed in a haze of half-finished assignments and distracted thoughts. Every now and then, he would hear footsteps from the hallway or catch glimpses of Julia passing by, but she never entered his room again. Her presence lingered in the house like an uninvited guest, unnoticed yet ever present. As the evening descended, the house grew quieter, and the shadows stretched long across the walls. The usual sounds of life, the hum of the refrigerator, the creak of the house settling, felt more pronounced, as if everything was conspiring to highlight the silence. Julia hadn't returned to his room since the brief, strange interaction earlier, and he was left with the sound of his own thoughts circling around in his mind. The unease that had gripped him all afternoon wasn't easing up. If anything, it seemed to be growing, feeding off his confusion and suspicions. He decided to go downstairs to get something to eat, hoping that the mundane task would help clear his head. The kitchen was empty, save for the quiet clinking of dishes in the sink. The air felt thick, almost oppressive. As he opened the fridge, he caught a glimpse of movement out of the corner of his eye. Julia's figure passed the doorframe, her silhouette momentarily visible before she disappeared into the hallway. There was something about her behavior that felt off, something he couldn't quite explain. Her presence in the house had always been a familiar one, but tonight it felt different. The way she had looked at him earlier, the way she moved now, there was a subtle shift, like she was trying to hide something. He set the glass of water down and leaned against the counter, watching the hallway, waiting for some sort of sign that would make sense of it all. Minutes passed in silence, the only sound being the soft rustle of papers from the living room. But then, without warning, Julia emerged again, this time more composed, almost as if she had regained some kind of control. She walked past the kitchen without sparing a glance, her footsteps measured and deliberate. She was headed toward the stairs, but before she could disappear out of view, she hesitated. A brief pause. The moment stretched out, the tension between them thickening. He stood frozen in the kitchen, wondering if he should say something, ask her if everything was okay. But as quickly as she had stopped, Julia continued on her way up the stairs, her presence once again slipping away like a shadow in the house. He couldn't help but feel like there was more to her actions than met the eye. The glance, the pause, the way she carried herself, it all seemed intentional, like a message he wasn't meant to understand. The evening wore on, and as the clock ticked forward, he remained in the kitchen, trying to shake the sense of discomfort that refused to leave. Julia's movements were erratic now, almost as if she was hiding something. Every time she passed by, there was a sense that she was avoiding him, deliberately keeping her distance. And when she returned to her room, the door closed with a soft click, leaving the house feeling emptier than it had been before. With the lights dimming and the house settling into a deeper silence, the feeling of suspicion grew. Something was unfolding in the house, something that had yet to be revealed. The quiet was no longer just the absence of sound. It was filled with the weight of unspoken words, things that had been left unsaid, but that were hanging in the air, ready to come crashing down. As the evening continued, the quiet in the house became almost suffocating. The lights in the hallway flickered on as night fell, casting long shadows on the walls. He had expected to spend the rest of the night in solitude, just like any other evening. But Julia's sudden reappearance in the living room disrupted that calm. He was sitting in the corner of the room, staring at the TV, but not really watching it, when he heard the soft creak of the floorboards. Julia stood in the doorway, framed by the dim light from the hallway. For a moment, she didn't speak, just watched him from the threshold, as though weighing something in her mind. Her presence felt heavier than before, and for some reason, he couldn't shake the feeling that she was watching him more closely than usual. She moved toward the couch with a purposeful stride, her steps slow but assured. The house felt even quieter now, the usual hum of the night settling in but somehow louder than before, as if the very air held its breath. Julia's eyes met his briefly, and for the first time, he noticed how intense her gaze had become. It was as if she was trying to communicate something without speaking. She placed her glass of wine on the coffee table and then sat down at the far end of the room. She seemed comfortable, almost too comfortable, as though she had been waiting for this moment to arrive. After a few moments of silence, she looked over at him, her eyes lingering. She smiled, an odd, knowing smile that didn't quite fit the situation. There was something about the way she held herself, poised and confident, that made him uneasy. She then stood up again and walked over to the mini-bar by the corner of the room. The soft clink of bottles filled the air, but her movements were too fluid, too controlled. He couldn't help but feel like she was making sure to keep him in her sights. Julia returned with a drink in hand, taking a deliberate sip. She glanced over at him again, her eyes a little more pointed this time, as if silently urging him to join her. The invitation was clear, yet unspoken. She gestured to the chair across from her with a casual movement of her hand, as if the invitation were the most natural thing in the world. The room felt charged with an energy that hadn't been there before. The soft lighting seemed to soften the tension, but it didn't erase the undercurrent of something unfamiliar, something that felt unsettling. The idea of joining her, of stepping into the space she had made, felt wrong in some instinctive way, but the allure of the invitation was hard to ignore. He remained in his seat, frozen for a moment, unsure of what to do next. Julia's attention shifted to the television, but the silence between them stretched long and taut. He could feel her gaze still lingering on him, even though her focus seemed elsewhere. There was a subtle shift in the atmosphere, a tension that grew with every second that passed. It was as if the room itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The air between them seemed thick, heavy, and full of unspoken promises. She took another sip from her drink, the quiet hum of the house filling the gaps between their stillness. He sat motionless, unsure of what to make of it all. The house, which had always felt like a safe, familiar place, now seemed like a stage, and Julia, more than ever, seemed like the one calling the shots. He wasn't sure whether to remain in his corner or to answer the silent call to join her, but whatever happened next, he knew that nothing in the house would ever be the same. The air between them hung thick as Julia sat across from him, her eyes never quite leaving him. The soft sound of clinking glass was the only interruption in the stillness that seemed to stretch longer with every passing moment. Her gaze was intense, almost too focused, as though she were trying to read something in him that he couldn't quite understand. Every now and then, she would glance away, but the attention she gave him was unmistakable. It was as if she was searching for something, and for the first time, he wasn't sure if it was something he was meant to see. She leaned back in her chair, her posture relaxed, but there was a tension in the way she held herself. Her movements were slow, calculated, as though she was in no rush, but was preparing for something. He watched as she placed her glass carefully back on the table, her fingers lingering just a moment longer than necessary around the rim. The silence between them felt heavier now, thick with anticipation, and it made the house seem even quieter, as if the walls themselves were listening. Julia's smile was soft, but there was a weight to it now. It was different from the casual smiles she'd given him before. This one held something hidden beneath the surface, something that sent a ripple of unease through him. She shifted slightly, her eyes never leaving his, and the atmosphere in the room shifted with it. It was subtle at first, but the change was undeniable. The space between them seemed smaller, as though the room itself was closing in. She shifted again, this time moving closer, her presence more immediate, more insistent. The closer she came, the harder it was to ignore the strange pull she had on him. His heart beat a little faster, and he shifted uncomfortably in his seat, trying to read her face, but it was like she was one step ahead of him. Julia's movements were smooth, fluid, controlled, each one executed with the precision of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. He stayed frozen, unable to move or say anything, his mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. But none of them seemed to make sense. There was a part of him that wanted to stay in his corner, to keep his distance, but the way she looked at him made it harder to think clearly. She reached out, her fingers grazing the edge of his arm, and the contact was light, barely there, but it sent a shock through him. It wasn't much, but it felt like a shift in the air, a new force entering the room. Julia didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Her presence alone seemed to speak volumes, and he could feel it in the way his body responded, in the way the room seemed to pulse with something unspoken. The tension between them was palpable now, thick and undeniable. He could feel his heart racing, could feel his breath catch in his throat. Every instinct told him to pull away, to retreat to the safety of the familiar distance he had always kept, but something about her closeness made him hesitate. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Julia remained just inches away, her gaze locked on his, waiting. He didn't know what she was waiting for, but the longer the silence stretched, the more his mind seemed to whirl. There was an unspoken invitation in the air, a tension that had been building all evening. The space between them had become charged, electric, and he was unsure whether he could keep his distance any longer. Julia's smile softened again, and for a brief moment, she looked almost vulnerable. But it didn't last. With one last glance, she stood up, the movement sudden and swift. He remained where he was, frozen in place, unsure of what had just happened. The room was still and quiet again, but now it felt different, as though the very atmosphere had shifted. The tension had been released, but something had changed. The silence felt heavier now, the weight of the unspoken hanging between them. And in that moment, it was clear, whatever had just passed between them wasn't something that could be ignored or erased. The house was quiet again, but it no longer felt the same. The energy in the room had shifted, and he couldn't shake the feeling that things were now heading down a path he hadn't expected. The quiet of the house seemed to stretch on endlessly. The evening was deepening, the shadows now long and consuming. Julia had disappeared upstairs, leaving him in the living room, alone with the unsettling tension that clung to the air. He couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed between them, but he wasn't sure what or why. His thoughts were scattered, and the usual rhythm of the evening had been disrupted, replaced by a gnawing discomfort that refused to go away. He sat on the couch, staring at the flickering television, but the images on the screen felt distant, meaningless. His mind was elsewhere, caught up in the events that had unfolded over the past few hours. Julia's behavior had been off, unmistakably so. Her attention, her touch, the way she had leaned in closer, it all felt wrong, like it had crossed an unspoken line. He couldn't ignore the unease that had taken root inside him, gnawing at his thoughts. Time passed slowly, but he couldn't bring himself to move. The quiet around him was oppressive now, the house too still, too empty. He heard footsteps overhead, faint and distant, but they were enough to remind him that he wasn't truly alone. Every creak of the floorboards above seemed louder in the silence, and the house felt more like a trap than a home. A sudden noise broke the stillness, the sound of a phone ringing, muffled through the walls. Julia's voice, soft and low, floated down the staircase moments later. She was speaking in hushed tones, as if trying to hide the conversation from him. The words were indistinct, but there was a tension in her voice that made him freeze. It was the same tension he had sensed earlier, the same unease that had built steadily throughout the day. The conversation lasted only a few minutes before the sound of the phone being hung up reached his ears. There was a brief silence, followed by the sound of footsteps moving toward the stairs. He couldn't explain it, but something about the way she had spoken, the tone of her voice, seemed different. It was as though she was hiding something she didn't want him to know. His stomach churned, and a sense of dread crept up his spine. Julia came back downstairs shortly after, her expression unreadable. She moved through the living room without acknowledging him, her steps quick and purposeful. She didn't look at him, didn't pause to say anything. It was as though she was deliberately avoiding him, her focus elsewhere. The coldness in her behavior was palpable, like a barrier had been erected between them. He stayed where he was, watching her every move, trying to understand what was happening. The more he observed, the more the knot in his stomach tightened. There was something going on, something beneath the surface that he couldn't see, but he could feel it. The distance between them had grown, and it was becoming harder to ignore. Julia returned to her room, the door clicking softly behind her, but the feeling of suspicion remained. It was like the house itself had become a place of secrets, each room hiding something just out of reach. He couldn't shake the feeling that things were slipping out of his control, that whatever was happening, whatever Julia was hiding, was something he wasn't meant to understand, at least not yet. The house grew quiet again, but the unease lingered, pressing down on him like a weight. The events of the evening had pushed him to the edge of doubt, and now, more than ever, he was certain that there was something Julia wasn't telling him. What it was, he still didn't know. But he had to find out. The feeling of uncertainty refused to let go, and he knew that soon enough, the truth would come crashing down, whether he was ready for it or not. The house had settled into an uneasy silence once again. The night had fully taken over, and the dim light from the hallway was the only source of illumination in the otherwise dark living room. He couldn't shake the growing discomfort that had been with him all evening, the sense that something was wrong. He remained in the same spot, his thoughts tangled in a web of suspicion and confusion, unable to find any clarity. Suddenly, the quiet was interrupted by the sound of the front door opening. The footsteps that followed were unfamiliar, a man's voice greeting Julia from the doorway. The words were muffled, but it was clear from the tone that this wasn't a casual visitor. He sat frozen, his senses heightened, as the conversation in the hallway grew louder, drawing him into its gravity. The man's voice was warm, familiar, but there was an undercurrent to it, something that felt too intimate, too comfortable for a mere acquaintance. Julia appeared in the living room a moment later, walking past him without sparing a glance. The man followed closely behind, stepping into the room with a polite smile. His presence in the house felt out of place, like an intruder that didn't belong. Julia introduced him as a colleague from work, but the way she said it, the way she avoided his gaze, made it clear that the man's role here was more than just a simple professional one. The man settled into a chair across from him, but the tension between them was palpable. He was polite, almost too polite, and his every movement seemed calculated, as if he were aware of the eyes on him, watching his every step. The conversation between Julia and her guest was low, their voices a constant hum in the background, but it wasn't the words that drew his attention. It was the way they spoke, the way they looked at each other. There was a familiarity, an ease in their interaction that hinted at something deeper. As the man and Julia exchanged pleasantries, the unease that had been growing all evening turned into something more tangible. He couldn't ignore the looks they shared, the subtle glances that passed between them when they thought he wasn't paying attention. There was an intimacy in their gestures, a silent communication that didn't involve words, but spoke volumes. It was clear now, whatever was going on in the house, whatever secrets Julia was hiding, they were shared with this man. He sat in the living room, trying to keep his distance, but the growing realization gnawed at him. His mind raced as he watched them interact, feeling like an outsider in his own home. The man wasn't just a visitor. He was part of something hidden beneath the surface, something he wasn't supposed to see. But it was there, plain as day, and the longer he sat in the room with them, the more he began to connect the dots. The conversation continued, but it felt like background noise now, his focus entirely on the subtle exchanges that spoke louder than words ever could. Julia and her guests seemed oblivious to him, lost in their own world, and the more he watched them, the more certain he became. There was something between them, something he wasn't meant to know but couldn't ignore. The man stayed for what felt like an eternity, and with every minute that passed, the tension in the room grew thicker. When he finally left, he and Julia exchanged a look, one that lingered a moment too long, a silent understanding passing between them. He left the house with the same familiarity he had entered, and Julia returned to the kitchen without saying a word. The house felt different now, the quiet deeper, more unsettling. He was left alone with his thoughts, piecing together the puzzle he hadn't even realized he was trying to solve. The visitor's presence, the way Julia had acted, the strange air between them, it all pointed to one undeniable truth. There was something going on, something that he wasn't meant to uncover. But now, he couldn't look away. The secrets were no longer hidden. They were just waiting for him to find them. The night had settled in with an oppressive stillness, the kind that seemed to press down on every corner of the house. He sat in the living room, trying to push away the unease that had been building steadily over the past few hours. The visitor was gone, but the unsettling feeling remained, lingering in the air like a heavy fog. Julia had gone back to her room, leaving him alone once again, but now the silence felt different. There was a weight to it, an unspoken tension that refused to dissipate. He couldn't stop thinking about what he had seen, the way Julia and the man had interacted. The subtle touches, the lingering glances, it all pointed to something more, something he hadn't been ready to acknowledge. He could feel the puzzle pieces falling into place, each moment from earlier in the day now taking on new meaning. His thoughts were racing, but his body felt frozen, stuck in place by the gravity of the situation. The house was silent, save for the occasional creak of the floorboards, as if the house itself were holding its breath. He couldn't ignore it anymore. His gaze fell on the phone on the coffee table, and before he knew what he was doing, he picked it up. It was Julia's phone. He hesitated, his fingers hovering over the screen for a moment, then unlocked it. The screen lit up, revealing a string of messages, the last one marked with a time just a few minutes before the visitor had arrived. His heart skipped a beat as he read the words, each one digging deeper into the pit of his stomach. The messages weren't from a colleague. They were personal, intimate. Words that he had no right to read, but couldn't ignore. The content of the messages left no room for doubt. Julia and the man were more than just friends. They were involved in something far beyond casual. He felt a rush of nausea as he scrolled through the texts, each one more revealing than the last. His hands shook as he continued reading, but he couldn't stop. There were plans, secret meetings, and promises of something more. They had been seeing each other for longer than he realized, and the fact that she had been hiding it from him, the fact that she had been hiding it from his father, was a betrayal he hadn't expected. The texts weren't the only thing he found. There were photos too, images that left him feeling sick to his stomach. Julia had taken pictures of moments he wasn't meant to see, moments that were clearly meant to stay hidden. He couldn't bring himself to look at them for long. The truth was undeniable now. There was no denying what had been going on behind closed doors. The weight of the discovery hit him like a ton of bricks. His hands were clammy, his breath shallow, and he felt a sense of panic creeping in. He had stumbled upon something he wasn't supposed to know, something that could shatter everything. The house, once a place of comfort, now felt like a cage, trapping him in the reality of what he had uncovered. Julia had been keeping secrets, and he had just uncovered one of the darkest. He didn't know what to do with this knowledge, how to process it, or what steps to take next. The only thing he knew was that the moment had arrived. The illusion of normalcy was gone, replaced by the stark truth of betrayal. He set the phone back down, the weight of the revelation heavy in his chest. He wanted to confront Julia, to demand answers, but the words didn't come. Instead, he was left alone with the truth, the silence around him now deafening. The house felt colder, more distant than it ever had before. He couldn't unsee what he had learned, and the knowledge of what had been happening under his roof seemed to eat away at him. It wasn't just the secrets that hurt, it was the realization that he had been blind to them all along. The truth had been there, hidden in plain sight, and now that it was uncovered, it felt like a weight he couldn't escape. It was a bitter, painful truth, one that would change everything. And as he sat there, alone in the stillness of the house, he knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The weight of the revelation hung heavy in the air, suffocating him with its undeniable truth. The house, once a place of familiarity, now felt foreign, like a darkened stage where every corner seemed to whisper secrets he wasn't meant to hear. He sat in the dimly lit living room, the phone still resting on the table in front of him, its screen a silent reminder of everything he had uncovered. The texts, the photos, they were etched in his mind, impossible to erase. The words that Julia had exchanged with the man were seared into his thoughts, and the more he thought about them, the harder it was to breathe. He knew what he had to do. The truth couldn't stay buried any longer. His mind raced as he stood, the cold floor beneath his feet grounding him in the reality of the situation. Every step he took toward the stairs felt like a weight he couldn't shake. His heart was pounding, each beat faster than the last, as he made his way up to Julia's room. He had to confront her, had to face her and demand answers. There was no avoiding it now. As he reached the top of the stairs, he paused outside her door, the soft hum of the house around him filling the silence. His breath caught in his throat as he stood there, wondering what he would say, how he would say it. The anger, the confusion, the betrayal, it all mixed together, creating a storm inside him that threatened to spill over. He didn't know if he was ready for the confrontation, but it was already too late. The moment had arrived. He knocked once, then pushed the door open, stepping into the room without waiting for an answer. Julia was standing by the window, her back to him, looking out into the darkened yard. She hadn't heard him enter, or maybe she had, but she didn't acknowledge it. Her silence was like a wall, and the distance between them seemed greater than ever. She hadn't turned around when he entered, and that only made his heart race faster. For a long moment, they stood there in silence, the tension between them growing with every second. He could feel the weight of everything he had learned pressing down on him, suffocating him. He couldn't hold it in anymore. He moved toward her, his voice low but steady as he finally broke the silence. Every word felt like it took everything he had to speak. Julia still didn't turn to face him, but her shoulders tensed at the sound of his voice. There was no mistaking the gravity of the situation now. She knew why he was here. She knew what he had discovered. The words spilled out of him in a rush: questions, accusations, everything that had been building inside him. The phone, the messages, the photos, they all came pouring out, and with each word, the room seemed to close in around them. Julia still hadn't turned to face him, but her silence now felt more deliberate, as if she were waiting for something. She stood still, her back to him, and for a moment, he thought she might not respond at all. The air was thick with the weight of everything unsaid. But then, slowly, she turned. Her face was unreadable, her expression calm, almost too calm. She met his eyes, and in that moment, he saw it, something in her gaze that told him she already knew the truth would come out. The look she gave him wasn't one of guilt or even surprise. It was something else, something he couldn't quite place. It was as if she had expected this moment, had been waiting for it. There was a long pause, and then Julia finally spoke, her voice soft, but with a sharp edge. The words she said were not what he expected. They were not filled with regret, not filled with apologies or explanations. Instead, there was something cold, something distant in her tone. She didn't deny anything. She didn't try to explain. She simply stood there, looking at him with a quiet intensity, as if she were waiting for him to come to terms with what had already happened. The truth was out now, and the silence that followed was not filled with relief or answers, but with a new, even more unsettling tension. The moment of confrontation had come, and it felt like the beginning of something far darker than he had ever imagined. The room felt colder now, the tension hanging in the air like a thick fog. The confrontation had been inevitable, yet the aftermath left him feeling more adrift than ever. The words that had passed between him and Julia had not brought the clarity he had hoped for. In fact, they had only deepened the confusion, leaving him with more questions than answers. Her calm, detached response had only heightened the feeling of betrayal that now gnawed at him, eating away at the remnants of trust that had once existed between them. He had left her room shortly after the conversation ended, his mind reeling from the weight of it all. The house, once a place of safety and familiarity, now felt like a foreign land. He walked through the hallways, his footsteps echoing in the silence. Each room he passed seemed to hold memories of a time before he had uncovered the truth, before the walls had come down. Now, everything felt different, colder, as though the very structure of the house had changed to reflect the unraveling of his world. He wandered aimlessly, unsure of what to do next, his mind constantly returning to the images of the messages, the photos, the secrets he had uncovered. The weight of them pressed down on him, each thought dragging him deeper into a pit of disbelief. How had it all happened? How had Julia, the woman who had been a part of his life for so long, kept something like this hidden? He had been blind to it all, unable to see the cracks forming beneath the surface, and now it was too late. Time seemed to stretch on, each minute feeling like an hour. He went to the kitchen, hoping that the mundane task of making something to eat would offer a brief respite from his thoughts, but even the act of preparing a simple meal felt hollow. The quiet of the house was deafening now, every sound magnified, every corner filled with the weight of unspoken words. As the evening wore on, he found himself sitting in the living room again, staring at nothing in particular. The TV was on, but it was nothing more than a distraction, a dull hum in the background. The reality of what had happened continued to settle in, sinking deeper into his bones with every passing second. The anger he had felt earlier had given way to a cold emptiness. What was the point of confronting Julia if there were no answers, no closure to be found? The house remained still, a place that once felt like home now seemed like a cage. He wanted to leave, to escape the suffocating atmosphere that had taken over, but where could he go? The outside world felt just as alien now as the house did. Every option seemed useless, every path leading to more uncertainty. His thoughts were a whirlwind, spinning in endless circles, each one leading to the same dark conclusion. Things had changed, and there was no going back. As the night wore on and the hours slipped by, he sat alone in the stillness, trying to process everything. But no matter how hard he tried, nothing seemed to make sense. Julia had been hiding a life that he had never known, a side of her that was now irreversibly tied to the truth he had uncovered. The life he had once known was gone, replaced by a new reality that felt impossibly foreign. The silence of the house wrapped around him, thick and heavy. There was no escaping it. No matter where he went, it would follow him. He wasn't sure what he was supposed to do next, but the one thing he knew for certain was that nothing would ever be the same again. The house, the people, the life he had once known, everything had shifted, and the path ahead was uncertain. He couldn't turn back now, not after everything he had uncovered. The house was unnervingly quiet, its silence pressing in from all sides. The hours after the confrontation had stretched on without any real change. Julia had retreated to her room, and he hadn't seen her since. The weight of the revelation still hung over him, as though the house itself had become a reflection of the broken trust between them. Every sound, every small shift in the house seemed amplified, a stark reminder of the tension that now filled the air. He wandered through the empty rooms, aimlessly, his mind a blur of thoughts. The house, which had once felt like a place of refuge, now seemed foreign, its familiar walls closing in on him. The memories that had once been comforting now seemed like distant echoes, reminders of a life that no longer felt real. There was nothing in the house that offered solace, no corner that felt safe. His thoughts kept returning to the same point, the moment he had uncovered Julia's secret, the realization that everything he thought he knew had been a lie. The phone, the messages, the photos, each detail replayed over and over in his mind, refusing to be forgotten. He felt the anger that had initially surged through him begin to ebb away, leaving behind a hollow emptiness. There was no satisfaction in knowing the truth, no relief in having the answers. In the end, it had only created more questions, more confusion, and more pain. The house felt abandoned, even though Julia was still there. The distance between them was palpable, as though some invisible barrier had been erected the moment he had discovered what she had been hiding. He thought about going to her, confronting her again, demanding an explanation, but the words seemed hollow now. What could be said that hadn't already been said? The truth was out, and nothing would change it. Whatever had been between them, whatever connection they had once shared, had been shattered beyond repair. The evening turned to night, and the house grew darker, the shadows in each room growing longer. He found himself at the window, staring out into the darkness. The world outside seemed far away, untouched by the turmoil inside. It felt like a different life, one that was no longer his. He couldn't escape the feeling that everything had been tainted, that every part of his life had been touched by the betrayal. The realization that things would never be the same again settled over him, like a heavy blanket. The future seemed uncertain, the path ahead unclear. He didn't know what he was supposed to do now, or how he was supposed to move forward. The familiar routines that had once defined his life now seemed meaningless, as though nothing could return to the way it was before. The house remained still as the hours passed. Julia stayed in her room, and he stayed in his own thoughts. The silence stretched on, suffocating and endless. He knew he couldn't stay like this forever, but he didn't know how to break free from the weight of it all. The truth had been revealed, and yet it hadn't brought the closure he had hoped for. Instead, it had left him in a state of limbo, caught between the past and the present, unable to move forward and unwilling to go back. The house seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something to happen, but nothing did. The night passed in a quiet, unremarkable way, as if time itself had slowed to a crawl. And in the stillness, he realized that the real struggle wasn't in finding the truth, it was in living with it.